Good morning, everyone. The Mediterranean has returned to the center of Europe's energy and geopolitical dynamics, from Eastern Mediterranean gas to the fragilities of North Africa, and Europe's race to redesign its supply routes. Since February 28, the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has turned the Gulf into a naval war zone. More than 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels, mines laid across the straits, shipping lanes, and 230 fully loaded tankers trapped inside the Gulf with no way out. A third US carrier strike group is now heading to the region, along with additional minesweepers. Um, on April 18, after negotiations collapse, Iran closed the strait again. Analysts are already calling it the largest oil supply disruption in the history of global energy markets. Today, we speak with Peter Stevenson of the Middle East Economic Survey, one of the most authoritative voice on the region's energy and political transformation, to understand to understand what is really changing and what we risk failing to see. So, welcome, Peter. So we start, I think, with the first questions. First question, with disruptions around Hormuz pushing oil prices higher, what do you see as the most underappreciated structural shift in the Mediterranean energy landscape over the past 2 or 3 years?
Thank you again for having me on, and it's always a pleasure to speak. And during this period of ups and downs of conflict, everybody focuses on what it means immediately, what could have been done to prevent it, and all of these things. So it's always it's always good to speak to people. It's always dialogue is very important. To answer your question, I think the most underestimated shift is how quickly Egypt has reemerged as the commercial anchor of the East Med gas system. We see both Israeli and potentially in the future Cypriot gas increasingly flowing towards the Egyptian infrastructure because it offers the fastest monetization route. So that has quickly shifted pricing power and infrastructure gravity towards Cairo, while also reinforcing the importance of existing assets over greenfield projects. So what you see is companies, governments, all focusing on what can be monetized as quickly as possible. And with these things, we see Eni, Italian company, in partnership with Total Energies, with the Kronos gas field offshore Cyprus, that they're moving towards a final investment decision to send the gas to Egyptian infrastructure with the aim to export this as LNG potentially to Europe. So these kind of projects where it's more short-term fixes rather than the long-term projects, large multi-billion dollar long-term projects. They've become more the focus in the last 2, 3 years because of the uncertainty in the region and how governments and companies react to this. You also have governments who have relatively, politicians have short-term electoral cycles. So, they want to impact things within the 4, 5 years that they have in office. Companies are the same. So you have large companies like Eni or Chevron or Total Energies. These companies, they have short investment cycles. So they'll see the investment over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And so they want to see a return on those investments relatively quickly. They don't want to invest in a large greenfield LNG project, let's say. I mean, ideally from a distance, one would say that maybe sending all the gas to Egypt increases the concentration risk in Egypt, a country that has not always been the most stable. Yes, there are moves from the US, from other Gulf countries to maintain a stability in Egypt because of its importance, of its geopolitical importance and position. Uh, but sending all the gas to one place, can be risky. Europe found out the hard way that having one supplier is a risk. So it goes both ways. Now, what's the solution? An LNG facility, maybe floating LNG facility offshore Israel, that was talked about, but I think security reasons preclude that. An LNG facility or FLNG facility offshore Cyprus would be ideal because it could give Europe a member state that has gas that could be sent to Europe. But unfortunately, Cyprus has many governance issues. Mega projects seem to be struggling in Cyprus. So everybody is focusing on Egypt. Egypt is the winner of this situation, it would seem, because of the fact that it already has the infrastructure and it has really strengthened that position over the last 2, 3 years, and through the conflict that's currently happening. I think it's kind of it's making people focus more on Egypt.
So I think we are already also replied a bit to the next question, and yes, this was very interesting. Your reply to this first question. And is the Mediterranean still best understood as Europe's periphery, or is the region emerging as a core strategic corridor linking Middle Eastern supply, North African instability, and European energy security?
Yeah, no, like you say, I kind of covered some of that, but
Yes.
it's no longer a periphery in energy terms. The East Mediterranean sits at the intersection of European diversification efforts, Gulf supply risk, North African demand growth. The region may not transform global balances. Maybe the resources that are there are not game changers on a global scale, but it is becoming an important flexibility provider, linking pipeline, LNG, electricity, interconnection corridors. All of these things are becoming more and more prominent. I think the current conflict has resurfaced talk about the India Middle East energy corridor IMEC, which was brought up previously, but it's an interesting project that seeks to link all of these different regions and all of these energy corridors, and it's very much it's a project that seems to have a lot of political backing. I think how this conflict ends and where the pieces fall will determine which energy corridors will see the light of day, because there are many different, everybody's talking about energy corridors now through Syria, through
So
Turkey,
I
through,
think we also discussed the other time, no, about like the great amount of gas that will come from Qatar, or that will hear in the future.
yeah, exactly. So, Qatar is looking to send gas, Saudi Arabia potentially, Israel. There are countries that have the surplus gas and they don't want to be dependent on one customer. They want to diversify the supply. So, and Europe is, of course, looking to diversify its supply after the whole the debacle with Russia. So it's definitely a region that Europe should have been focusing on for more than the recent conflict period. It should have been really focusing on it before the Russia-Ukraine war happened. And then immediately after the Russia-Ukraine war, it really should have focused down on the East Mediterranean, because it does provide Europe with a potential gas from its own member state. But unfortunately, the EU, Europe is not everybody sees eye to eye. Policies are not always, very focused or or cogent. So you see a lot of talk, but not so much action. And unfortunately, or for not unfortunately, but the way the world works, action needs to come from companies usually. They're the ones that have the assets and they're the ones that need to make the decisions. Of course, policies and grants and various other things that the governments and the EU can help with need to be made easier for these companies, and they
And
need to be given,
this will come, yes, yes.
motivation.
We'll
Yeah.
speak more, maybe better a bit about this in the last question.
Yeah.
And but now I wanted to ask you from a Miss perspective, how could the current conflict reshape energy flows across the Eastern Mediterranean? I think also we already covered a bit of this,
Yeah.
but particularly given like risk of shipping, offshore infrastructure, and regional gas trades. Where might the market be underestimating potential impacts, let's say?
So the key impact is the growing premium on infrastructure security and redundancy. We saw Israel shut in two gas fields. We've seen Qatar shut in production. Uh, I mean, the temporary shut-in of Israeli gas fields, it demonstrated how quickly regional balances tighten when a single source is disrupted. Egypt and Jordan were heavily impacted by the reduction of Israeli gas. Israel was able to maintain gas to its own domestic market with the Tamar gas field, but it wasn't able to really export much gas. And so Jordan, which depends a lot on Israeli gas, and Egypt as well, which depends quite a lot on Israeli gas, we're scrambling to find alternatives. Now they have LNG import infrastructure to import LNG, but as we saw, prices of LNG skyrocketed. So this wasn't really a feasible alternative at that time. Uh, Markets, they might be underestimating how conflict risk could accelerate diversification efforts, particularly, LNG import capacity expansion and flexible contracting structures in those countries. So on one hand, Egypt and Jordan were prepared because they had learned from the previous conflict that, maybe Israeli flows will reduce, but they weren't prepared for the price increase in LNG. So maybe this will push countries to look for energy diversification, more renewables, other interconnection, electricity interconnections. But again, though electricity interconnection makes you dependent on neighbors, and in this region, that can be quite a risky business.
Okay, we'll start now with the question more like how we look, let's say, in the future. No?
Mhm.
So, looking toward 2027, what practical steps should Europe take now to strengthen energy resilience in the Mediterranean and translate geopolitical disruption into long-term supply security?
Yeah, I kind of answered this a little bit as well before. I mean, it just goes to show you how everything is kind of interlinked, and it's a kind of
Yes,
holistic kind of view of
yes,
things.
yes.
But
Oh, this
I'm
way is better portrayed also. Yeah.
So Europe should focus on bankable infrastructure and not so much on, some grand strategy. You need to make the first steps. You can't, you need to learn to walk before you can run is the famous proverb. But supporting interconnections, LNG flexibility, and commercially viable export routes from the East Med will do more to improve resilience than, politically ambitious but slow-moving mega projects in the near term. Now, you always need to have a strategy, right? You always need to look long term and think about the future because if you don't, then, every 5 years you're playing catch up, you're scrambling to find solutions, which is kind of what the EU is doing right now, and what some countries in the region are also doing. They a conflict will happen and that will think, okay, we need to sort out our strategy. But then the next conflict comes and
Mm,
the dynamics change as we saw just now. So,
yes.
uh,
Like
I mean,
reactive policies, not
exactly.
not like thoughtful, like let's say.
No proactive. It's
Yes,
reactive, not
yes,
proactive.
yeah.
So, of course, you never know what the next conflict will bring, but the more uh, redundancies you have, the more options you have, the more options that gives you. Now, I mean, just looking purely from the Cyprus perspective, where I'm in Cyprus, it's criminal that Cyprus, which is sitting on 15 to maybe 18 trillion cubic feet of gas, is relying on importing diesel and fuel oil for power, you know. So the people on this island in the coming months, well, we've already started having to pay more for petrol in the car.
Mm,
Soon we're going to have to be paying higher electricity prices, which we're already paying higher electricity prices in Europe, because the country has not managed to, firstly, develop any gas or get any of the companies to develop any gas and send some of that gas to the island. It's been unable to complete an LNG import project, which is going through European Public Prosecutor Office investigations, and also it's been unable to proceed with, the GSI, the Great Sea Interconnector, which is hoping to connect the electricity network of Cyprus and Greece and onto Europe. So Cyprus's political failure means that, the people on the street are having to pay extra out of their pockets. So sure, we need quick fixes, but we also need a long-term strategy. And I don't think, Cyprus doesn't have one. Europe began this net zero ambition, crazy ambition, if you ask me, you know, of course it's good to put a target that maybe you know deep down you're not gonna meet, but try to reach it. But then there needs to be a balance. You need to be able to provide relatively cheap electricity for people, um, because people are accustomed to a certain way of life in Europe. Let's put it that way, and then build on that. So it's a balancing act, but action needs to be taken. Enough sitting down and talking and trilateral meetings and bilateral meetings, governments talking. They need to find a way to get these companies to move to develop gas, and try and find ways to encourage them and to give them incentives to provide cheaper energy for the people on the public.
yeah, and I think this is a great statement, and yeah, very very useful. And so it's been a great pleasure as always to discuss with you, Peter. And I think we touch a lot of very interesting themes uh, here in this chat. It's been very great to discuss how the energy landscape is evolving in these changing, chaotic times. And also, we are lucky to have you here today because, if I remember correctly, also the Iran war was touching Cyprus a bit of time
I think
ago.
I think that was slightly over exaggerated. I
Yeah,
mean, obviously there was a drone that hit the airfield in Akrotiri in the British bases, but I I don't think that I think it was overestimated. The whole impact on Cyprus. But yeah, everybody's concerned, and yeah, I appreciate you having me on again as always, and I look forward to the next chat. Hopefully, it won't be in a conflict time, but
yeah.
this region has taught us many things, and I think that's that conflict is never far away.
So I hope we created something interesting to hear for who will listen. And ciao, Peter. See you next time.
See you, Matteo. Thank you very much.